Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. What if living human bodies were exchangeable as currency? What was it that led artist, writer, and philosopher Pierre Klossowski to conceptualize living currency as the medium of exchange in the parodic utopia? In the essay of the same name, Living Currency, today we are joined by distinguished scholar and translator Vernon W. Cisney to begin Acid Horizon's foray into the work of Pierre Klossowski, who is an eminent figure in what would become the tradition of French Communism and post-structuralist thought. Vernon, whom we interviewed on his recent lecture series, The Devil, a Biography, joins us this morning to help kick things off. Vernon, thank you for joining us on the episode here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, this will be our first official foray into the work of Pierre Klossowski on the podcast. And as we know, his work has been extremely influential on the figures that matter most to us: Deleuze, Foucault, Bataille, Baudrillard. And also, Klossowski's work is heavily informed by the work of Nietzsche. And as I understand it, Klossowski was responsible for being one of the primary translators of Nietzsche's works into French. And so what I intend to do, or what we intend to do today, is just sort of get an overview of Klossowski's influence, some of his core concepts, and maybe highlight some of the connections to some of the other thinkers in an attempt to create some interest in his work. So if I were to say to you, Vernon, who is Pierre Klossowski and why should we be looking at his work, and how has the influence of Nietzsche on Klossowski and French communism, how has all of that had an impact in terms of your interest philosophically?
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you very much for having me on here. I think that one of the really important things that Klossowski brings to the conversation, one of the things that he does is bridges the gap, let's say, between Nietzsche as a thinker of affect, a multiplicity notion of selfhood, right? Mm-hmm. Bridges that with the concerns of a sort of post-Marxian French tradition. So in other words, Nietzsche, who himself was not really interested in that much in economics and, had little to say about capitalism or anything like that. But his affective theory gets sort of smushed together, let's say, mm-hmm. gets synthesized nicely with Marx's analysis of capitalism in such a way that you can start to look at the connections more effectively between the individual and the social order, mm-hmm. and the ways in which desires become constituted. Like, Marx, of course, knows this, but Klossowski's work, I think, helps do some of the work to explaining how this happens, how the capitalist system codes our, to use Deleuze Guattari's term, codes our desires in such a way that we continue to be, willing mm-hmm. slaves of capital.
I think one of the fundamental concepts that we need to bring in here is just the concept of individuality and the notion of perhaps bourgeois individuality. I think one of the things that we get from Nietzsche, and maybe you can help us explain this, is that a sort of presupposed, prefigured notion of an individual unity is something that the capitalist system, for example, is parasitic upon. But what we get in Klossowski via his interpretation of Nietzsche is that what is most fundamental is not this sort of notion of individuality. And I mean, this is something that even Marx himself undoes in his own way in his work. But with Nietzsche and Klossowski's Nietzsche, we get a sense that everything that we understand as the individual is this multiplicity of impulsions or forces that in the mask of the individual becomes selected and hierarchicalized. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, yeah, Nietzsche, and this is why I think Nietzsche is so important for these figures. I still see a lot of people, on Twitter or X, whatever, saying things like, oh, well, the left has, should have nothing to do with Nietzsche. He was reactionary, blah, 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 blah. I think it's very difficult to put I think it's very difficult to put Nietzsche in those categories, precisely because he's very difficult to pin down, as Will was saying in the conversation before we started recording. I mean, there are things in Nietzsche that you can use for reactionary purposes. There are things in Nietzsche that you can use for, full-blown liberatory purposes and so forth. And I think in part it's because he's just a philosopher. He's not thinking about, contemporary worldly politics, right? But okay, to come to your question, Nietzsche does all these analyses very early on. There are the three works that are sort of considered his aphoristic works: Daybreak, or The Dawn, The Human All Too Human, and The Gay Science. The Gay Science being sort of the culmination of the three. But Daybreak is really, really interesting because it's reflections on morality and moral impulses and so forth. And there are a couple of aphorisms in there where Nietzsche is talking about, he's doing these analyses of the drives, right? And he says, so let's take a very common example. You're standing outside a restaurant or something, someone walks out and they start laughing, right? And he says, every person will interpret this differently depending upon who they are and what's going on in that particular day. So one person might say, might feel compelled to look at their shirt, check their clothes. Do I have something on me? Is that why they're laughing? Do I have a booger in my nose? Do I have a piece of food in my teeth? What are they laughing about? Another person might pause and say, laughter, right? Laughter. What is laughter? Why do human beings laugh, right? The philosopher. Another person might get really offended, like, what the fuck are you laughing at? Another person might just be, I call this the SpongeBob reaction. Another person might just be happy to have contributed to the joy in the world, right? Oh, they're laughing at me. Great. I've made them happy today. And he says, and at the end of the day, what you can say is that whatever the response was, there was a drive that was waiting, that was hungry, that was waiting to manifest itself. And so another example that he uses, he talks about ways that we can combat drives. This is in another one of the aphorisms. And he says, well, we can try to starve all the drives to the point where they just lose their appetite. We can try to overindulge to the point that we no longer want the thing. I remember when my cousin was caught smoking when he was a kid. This was a different time, keep in mind. He was caught smoking. And so my uncle, sat him down at the table with 2 cartons of unfiltered Camel cigarettes and made him smoke until the point that he threw up, right? The idea being, oh, is this what you want? Okay, here's what this does to you. Now, it did not deter him from smoking. In fact, he became like a chain smoker after this event. But my uncle's impulse was that Nietzsche's describing, that we can try to just, stuff it to the point where it gets disgusted at the very thought of satisfying this drive. So Nietzsche goes through and he gives all these elaborate mechanisms that we have of trying to combat the drives. And then he says, but what's important to note is that the will to combat a drive is itself the manifestation of another drive. And so to use the smoking example, right? Okay, I want to quit smoking. I want to stop smoking. So I'm going to, starve myself, or I'm going to wean myself off. I'm going to use nicotine patches, or I'm going to vape, or something like this. But Nietzsche would say that impulse itself to say, let's stop smoking. What is that? Well, it could be a manifestation of, a sex appeal thing. Maybe I'm on the dating market and women just don't find smokers that attractive. Maybe it's, I'm waking up coughing and I realize I'm coming to terms with my mortality and I want to live longer, or something like this. The point is, it's always a drive that emerges and asserts itself. And eventually, right, let's say I've been trying to quit smoking. Eventually, if I finally do, it's because that drive finally won. And another component of this is that we, because of grammar, and Nietzsche's pretty consistent about this too, we use the word I. I had a cigarette this morning, even though I'm quitting smoking, right? And the word I, because it's used across various contexts, we get this sense that there's something substantial about the I, when really it's the drives themselves that are manifesting in these various ways. So I go to the bar, back when you could smoke in bars. I'm sitting with my friends. They're lighting up and I'm the only person not lighting up. And they say, oh, no, come on, light up. And I'm no, I'm quitting. No, come on, just have one. And then I say, okay, all right, just this one because I'm quitting, right? So I'm quitting as I'm lighting the cigarette. And Nietzsche would say this is a manifestation of drives, and all the work that he does on this, on this notion of the drives, which, by the way, is for Klosowski extremely important in Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle as well. It does a lot of interesting work towards bridging the gap towards French Marxism as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think what I'll do is I'm just going to add the Klosowski piece on it. And so Klosowski, and Dan does this in his essay in Living Currency. He gives us a kind of an extended lexicon of these concepts.
Yeah.
And what Klosowski is doing, in addition to Nietzsche, is he's drawing from the early Christian mystics about their theories of the soul as being the sort of incommunicable and sort of multiplicitous entity that isn't conterminous with a notion of individuated identity. And what Dan has written, I think, is really nice. He says, in and of itself, the nature of the soul is incommunicable for Klosowski. The soul is irreducible to the words that would translate it or the images that would try to contain it. So as these drives are emergent, they themselves don't have a specific discourse or morality attached to them. It's only in their emergence, their selection, and hierarchicalization that then they get a kind of face. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the notion of the phantasm and then of the simulacra. But I didn't want to take the wind out of Will's sails because I cut him off. He had a really nice question about Nietzsche that I think now's the right time to elaborate. So Will, I don't know if you wanted to build on that.
Yeah, I'm interested in a really broad picture because this question gets asked a lot, but I don't think we ever find our way kind of into it in a fashion that's compelling. Broadly speaking, my question circles around the big question of why Nietzsche, right? Because throughout the history of continental, or we could loosely call and probably incorrectly call Western philosophy, right? Nietzsche ends up being this culminating force that fundamentally alters the practice of philosophy in the way that, say, Marx fundamentally alters the practice of history. But Nietzsche resonates differently in different parts of the world, in different traditions, right? The literary tradition following Nietzsche, right? If you read, let's say, like Paul Celan, right? Or the philosophical tradition in Germany between, let's say, the way in which Nietzsche is read by Heidegger or Ludwig Klages versus the Nietzsche that manifests in Bataille and Klosowski. They're all radically different. And in part, this is because of the multiplicity of Nietzsche himself, right? Nietzsche is happy to be contradictory. And I think it's one of the most compelling parts about him as a philosopher. But Nietzsche also ends up being this remarkable battleground for the history of philosophy. And Nietzsche's legacy becomes something that is a source of trouble for Klosowski and Bataille at the Asphalt Journal and their little cult, right? And, you have on the one side of the world, the cosmic circle, right? Which is this more fascistic-y kind of vitalist group. And then you have this other kind of vitalist group with Asphalt. But my question is, what is it about Nietzsche's approach to forces that is so compelling to these French theorists who are worried about particularly production and economy, very generally? Because one of the things that you'll notice is Nietzsche doesn't actually really focus on the words that we love to sort of fetishize, like political economy, right? Like, he's not really worried about Adam Smith, although he has his criticisms of liberalism in a very broad sense of the term. So why is it that Nietzsche is being taken from this, let's say, philosophical, poetic space and drawn in to an extremely materialist approach to economy?
It's such a huge question, and there are so many different avenues that you can look at, right? The specific critiques that he offers of liberalism, which are very often the some of the fodder, become some of the fodder for the left readings that reject Nietzsche, right? His seemingly anti-democratic impulses, for instance. Not to mention that he's often very critical of socialist movements and anarchist movements explicitly, right? And so there's that can be looked at. The moments when he does venture into political discourse seem to be kind of, fraught, right? I think, God, it's such a huge question. So then why Nietzsche? One of the things that he does that is so instrumental, I think, is this, if we want to use this term, this breakdown, this deconstruction, if you will, of the notion of the liberal self, as Craig said earlier, the bourgeois self, the notion of individuality. And I do think that there is this sort of, well, let me put a pin in that, because that is something that seems to be so taken for granted, the notion of a sort of robust notion of individuality, the notion that I am a coherent, unified self, that I am making a decision, that it's my desires, and that democracy is about a system where, people can fulfill their desires as long as they are not, as individuals, infringing upon the desiring rights of other individuals or something like that. Something that's so taken for granted throughout so much of, contemporary media discourse, political discourse, that I think that Nietzsche, the way that he breaks that down so radically, I think is really important. And to the question of, like why he has such an influence on artists and, poets and philosophers like Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze, is that because he's breaking down this notion of radical individuality, he's also giving a bit of a platform, I guess you could say, to philosophical conceptions of madness, and the ways in which philosophical conceptions of madness can problematize the conceptions of individuality, bourgeois individuality, the ways in which madness as a philosophical concept can inform our thinking about the formations of rationality. Yeah, Will, I see you raising your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I think Nietzsche can help us resist, and you get it in, frankly, you get it in Karl Korsch, you get it in Lukács, you get it in these Marxist figures that were very instrumental to critical theory, is the assumption that the bourgeois subject is necessarily at odds with social reproduction.
Yeah.
Right? Nietzsche allows us to say, like, whoa. Was this 19th century bourgeois subject actually this radical?
Yeah.
Like, Nietzsche allows us to be able to separate critique from the assumption of the unity of the transcendental subject.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm thinking maybe that's what it is. It was something that was fundamentally lacking in the history of socialism in the 19th century, was this assumption that the Rousseauian political subject was at odds, in contradiction. The subject of right was in contradiction with the mode of production.
Mm-hmm.
And a very specific use of Nietzsche can allow us to be like,
yeah,
the subject of right seems a lot like a very particular kind of Homo economicus, right? Like,
yeah.
He has all of these potentials. He is very much a he, right? All of these sort of remarkable, what Deleuze would call subjective presuppositions. Maybe I asked you the question the wrong way and you answered it correctly. Was that Nietzsche allows us to take a step back. And in fact, Nietzsche doesn't have to be pulled into the tradition of materialism. Nietzsche's actually burrowed a little hole beneath what we thought, materialist analysis was. Like, Nietzsche is saying, oh, you haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what the new philosopher for Nietzsche means. It is folks like Pierre Klossowski who can dig further when he asks questions like, where does this power come from? Because Klosowski is doing something. I know that Craig did just an amazing essay on the right to be lazy, where Paul Lafargue, who is I think the son-in-law of Marx, right? Craig, nod if that's correct. Okay,
that's right.
where Klosowski's like, where Lafargue is like, this is the history of the productive human being, and he starts with ancient Greece politically, but Nietzsche's going to start on the side of ontology and metaphysics, right? In the way that, for example, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, like Aristotle's conception of the productive person is necessarily something that aligns with his account of natural slavery. And that's consistent through De Anima, through the politics, and especially through the Nicomachean Ethics. So to start at the level of the useful, to start at the level of production, Nietzsche allows us to see how a particular understanding of life and its forces necessarily coincides with the capitalist mode of production. So maybe I was wrong to say, Nietzsche's brought into materialism. It's like, no, Nietzsche's already a materialist.
Yeah.
And there are these moments in Zarathustra, for instance. Zarathustra is really good for this because there's all of this stuff about, we yammer on about the soul, right? My soul this, my soul that. But you don't understand that what's more important, what's more fundamental is the body. And, instead of heaven, the ideals of heaven, we're going to talk about the earth. And so I think there is a definite sense in which Nietzsche is very much a materialist.
And just to build off of Will and of course you, Vernon, as well, I just think about how Nietzsche has been indispensable to theorizing a notion or a theory of forces against the productivism of the 19th and 20th century. And in the figure of Klosowski, and then in Bataille, and then in Deleuze and Guattari, what we see is either a kind of metaphysics or a critique of ontology that attempts to break the back of ontology in order that it does not reconstruct or reconstitute this notion or the presupposition of a bourgeois individuality. And I think, the very real sort of historical and material circumstances from, let's say, the mid to late 1920s onward was that the Soviet Revolution did not seem to deliver the goods that it said it was going to deliver. And this is Bataille's critique precisely in The Accursed Share and the notes that follow that, is that the productivism of the Soviet Union in a way rivals and perhaps even outstrips that of capitalism insofar as it attempts to achieve the sort of peak in rationality by organizing all the forces of society in the name of creating an incessantly productive edifice. And it has very sort of real circumstances for policy under Stalin, for example. So, Stalin created a work program that essentially took the free time of the laborers and turned it into training programs and things of that sort that kept laborers occupied anywhere between 8 and 12 hours a day so that they could be trained for all kinds of jobs. And this is something that we talked about in the episode with Stuart Kendall, where this notion of equality and productivity converged to create a social subject that was essentially flattened, that we could, in every worker, have a worker who was completely modular and do every kind of task. And then in order to be able to have that sort of thing, well, we needed the time to train that sort of worker, which meant marshaling all of those forces that lied beneath, for example, maybe the predominant tendencies of a given individual, to try to convert them into being a component in this massive socio-political apparatus. And I think Nietzsche, for Asafel, Bataille, and even in Living Currency, as we see it here, this notion of a theory of impulsion, theory of forces, phantasms, and simulacra is poised against what seems to be this inexorable march of industrial production from the 19th century into the 20th century. And what Klosowski and others are trying to do here is create the theoretical apparatus that's able to undermine that.
I think that's right. And I mean, this is what, 1969 or 70?
70, I think. Yeah.
And I mean, for me, it's difficult to imagine Deleuze co-authoring Anti-Oedipus in the absence of Living Currency. I could be completely wrong, but the what he does, what Klosowski does, is bridge libidinal economy and political economy, which is kind of the the core of, what's going on in anti-Oedipus. It's their way of approaching criticism or critiques of both Marxism, orthodox Marxism, and orthodox psychoanalysis.
Vern, it's great. I'm enjoying this discussion of Nietzsche a lot. It just makes me want to drop everything and read him right now. But Klosowski, for me, and I've been pushing for us to talk about him for like a while now, and Craig's very inclined to do this too. But I just recently rereading Deleuze's book on masochism and his distinction in talking about sadism versus masochism. And it's really becoming clear here because Klosowski spends a good amount of ink talking about Sade, which I find very interesting. And I'm sure it's because of his affiliation with Bataille even. Like they're all talking about Sade all the time. And it really becomes clear here that what Deleuze kind of picks up is that sadism, the relationship between it and institutions, as opposed to what Deleuze calls, the relationship between masochists and the contract and contracts. And in Klosowski, I was just wondering, maybe if you could just give us a moment of riffing on why Sade is here again. What is Klosowski trying to do with Sade, and then how does it have to do with this opening discussion of impulses, right? And is there overlap with Nietzsche here? Just help me situate what, if you can, like what Klosowski wants to do there. And maybe, I was talking to Craig about this. I think Klosowski does a better job of talking about Sade than Bataille does. Personally, it's a little more clear to me, and there's a lot of maybe more poetic riffing that Bataille is doing, which might kind of make things difficult. But I'm just curious about what sadism has, how that plays into this. It would be good for the viewer to understand what living currency is about.
I think that one of the things that these figures find interesting about Sade and about Zacher-Mazak both would be something that Nietzsche himself would, I think, find interesting, which is that they don't run away from the uglier elements of human behavior, right? In a sense, it sort of dovetails nicely with what Deleuze says about the image of thought in Difference and Repetition and elsewhere, where he says, the image of thought includes this notion of the goodwill on the part of the thinker, right? That thought necessarily pursues what is true, and that every form of deviation from that is just lumped in with the notion of error. So schizophrenia is just an erroneous form of thought. Not finding truth is just an erroneous form of thought. Tyranny is just an erroneous form of thought, etc. Likewise, we could say that going along with this notion of, Enlightenment rationality, bourgeois rationality is the idea that aberrant desires, let's say, so-called, would be the desire to inflict pain, the desire to receive pain, what have you, would just be inadequate ways of thinking about desire. And that desire naturally desires one's self-interest, that desire naturally pursues what is good for the individual or something like that. And I think that these thinkers like Sade and Zacher-Mazak, for thinkers like Klosowski, they put the lie to that assumption, right? Because they explore in all of its ugliness, the ugliness. That's a morally loaded term, but you get the idea. They explore in all of its unsavory aspects, let's say, the ways in which desire can manifest as all of these other things, that there is no one codedness to what desire is. And this, Nietzsche talks about cruelty in the Genealogy of Morality, where he says, he's looking at the evolution of the debtor and creditor relationship. And he says, time was that if you couldn't pay back a debt, you would be humiliated in the public. You would be tortured in the public. You would be displayed and have shame and bodily harm inflicted upon you. And this was the way that the creditor got their recompense. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's indicative of a cruelty impulse in human beings. And Nietzsche says, now, I can already hear the nihilists giving me shit about this, right? I'm not saying it's the only impulse. But it is one of the impulses. It's one of the impulses that's very real, and coming to terms with it will help us understand how this notion of debt, which was purely material, purely economic, eventually transforms into a notion of guilt, which is moral, right? And so that would be my first response. I know that there's a lot more to it than that, but that's my initial stab.
No, definitely. I think super helpful. It's just interesting. It's also interesting because there's an early, Dan talks about this early in his essay, that, and we've been teasing this out a little bit, is that Klosowski is very, like, he's coming from this, he almost was like a Catholic seminary, right? Or something like that. He was very
aristocratic.
You almost took the path. Yeah. And he's coming from, like, knowing a lot about theology here, which is I think is very fun. And he's concerned with questions of art, with creating art. He's an artist as well, like an erotic artist. And he talks about things like demonology. And I was wondering, like, because and it's a fun word, right? And I was like, oh, cool. We're talking about demons now, but he's trying to make a point on demonology, and I think relating to impulses and relating to the multiplicity of, I guess, of the soul that we were talking about. But with art, I want to bring art in here a little bit, because what's going on with Klosowski and art, and is there something with is there a link with his interest in sadism there, or is this a separate lane? I just wanted to know, because he eventually quits writing just to do art later in life. He gives up, I think, on the usefulness of writing. From what I understand, he abandons it. What is this Living Currency book doing that might explain that later too? If you know, there's all these questions about art and demons and whatnot and so forth.
Let's see. Well, I can speak to the demon stuff if that's interesting, and then maybe Craig would want to speak to the art stuff. The demon stuff is I think is really fascinating. So there are a couple of things that Klosowski that Dan Smith, by reading Klosowski the way that he does, enables, a reading of Nietzsche that I think is really useful, and actually I think more accurate than he's often given credit for. So Nietzsche is very, because of the whole death of God thing, and God is dead, and his relentless assault on the history of Christendom and so forth. He's very often, from a perspective of the late 20th century, early 21st century, Nietzsche is very often characterized as an atheist, which is not a silly thing to say, but it is a bit reductive to say, because we're using the term atheist from a 20th century perspective and applying it to a 19th century thinker who would not conform to the categories of atheism that we think of today, because the categories of atheism today are very much motivated by a scientism, right? Almost a theological notion of scientism, that science is going to save us, that science is, where truth is found, capital T truth. And Nietzsche, even in the, 19th century, is already worried about this. He talks about this in Zarathustra, that science has become the new sort of religious, the satisfaction of the religious impulse. It's where we now find the assurances about, making sense of the world, making sense of the sort of precarity of life, and that it's come to fill the role that religion once filled. He's worried about it in the genealogy of morality. He talks about it as ascetic, right? He says the sciences are not the alternative to the ascetic ideal. They are the latest, most recent manifestation of it. And so Nietzsche does not fit comfortably into that category. Nietzsche himself says in, I think it's Twilight of the Idols, that, we can't necessarily determine what the value of life is, right? Because we're alive. And so we have a vested interest in the question, which makes it impossible for us to objectively determine. But what we can say is that we are value positing beings. We are beings who create these values, right? We project our values onto these things. They were, from time immemorial, they were our gods. Christianity has sort of tried to monopolize that sense of creativity of values, and it's tried to say it's just this one value, right? But if you think back to the ancient world, what were the gods? The gods were expressions of human values, and we were perfectly fine with saying there were tons and tons of different gods. There were gods that were there for justice, and gods that were there for conquest, and gods that were there for mercy, and gods that were there for hospitality and forgiveness, and all of these things, all of these, values manifested in these figures called gods, right? As history evolves and Christianity and monotheism becomes the dominant order du jour, all of those other gods, they evolve from being not just gods, not just false gods, but eventually demons, right? Daimon is the word that is used in the New Testament to characterize ancient pagan gods, but also the things that we come to know as demons. Well, what would Nietzsche, what would Klosowski think of these things? That these things we call them demons, or the Christian tradition calls them demons, but in reality, they are subterranean, subconscious expressions of desire that are constantly trying to get out, and going back to the conversation earlier, constantly undoing that notion of bourgeois subjectivity. So, Craig, do you want to say something about how that relates to art?
Sure. Yeah, I almost feel like we should flesh out the entire theory of Klosowski's framework, from impulses to phantasms to simulacra and stereotypes. And we can do that. But I think there's actually a way that we can talk about why, for example, at the end of Klosowski's life, he essentially retired from writing and turned solely to the fine arts. And I think it first lies in identifying what he thought was a preeminent ethical value for him was the richness and enlivening aspect of the incommunicability of the phantasmagoric essence of our life. And there's a lot of ways that just to drop a few names respectfully on the listeners' ears with respect to figures that we've discussed in the past, I think there's actually a connection that we can make, for example, to Klosowski's understanding of the phantasm, which could be translated as fantasy, but was not. But understanding that the impulses form the font of the phantasmagoric or the fantasy within us is very similar in a sense to understandings of the unconscious in Freud and Jung, and maybe even the notion of an archetype. And the difference being is that when we formulate a kind of image, let's say an artistic image or a mythic image, it's informed for Klosowski by this phantasm, what he calls the phantasm. I like to call it the phantasmagoric flow, because I think that captures the ineffability of the concept that he's trying to put forward, which is to say that when we have this sort of intimation, this deep aesthetic intimation of our own desire, or the example that Dan actually puts forward in the opening essay of Living Currency is that when we fall in love, for example, there's this kind of affective and, wholly rapturous experience that we undergo that takes the other person to be the object of that series of flows. The difference being that we can fall in love many times in our life and have that experience come up with a different content. And when we fall in love with different people, we have different experiences and so on and so forth. And some of those experiences satisfy certain aspects of our desire, our expectations, and so on and so forth. But how do we characterize the feeling of falling in love itself? How can we abstract that away from any given instance of falling in love? And it's this concept of a phantasm that does it for us. I think similarly too, for Klosowski, when any of that sort of phantasmagoric flow erupts in the form of an artistic expression or a piece of discourse, for example, particularly a philosophical discourse or maybe some other kind of writing discourse, what it becomes is it becomes trapped in the limitations of the ossified meaning and languages that exist outside of it. So there's a way in which that language is always a falsification of the true character of the phantasmagoric flow. And this isn't to say that, there's no use or there's no importance or anything like that for discourse itself, but it undermines that ethical richness and enlivenment that Klosowski thought was so important. And so towards the end of his life, he moved back towards art because he believed that the corporeal idiom, as he called it, that could be represented in erotic art, for example, or sculpture, was more adequate to the task of conveying the contradictory unity. When I say contradictory unity, I don't mean unified in the total sense, but unified in the whole sense, in that which is contradicted has its own difference validated somehow. So there's a specific image that can allow us to articulate that example. Klosovsky talks about, for example, in a piece of art, you have a figure who has one hand pushing someone away and the other hand inviting that person. In the realm of language, in the logic of language, and in formal logic, that it would appear as a contradiction. But in the world of the image, it does not. And so for him, there's something happening at the level of the image that ordinary discourse does not allow. The question is, well, can language allow this somehow? Klosowski does point to a concept which is called solicism. This is a word that I had to look up, and this is my first time speaking that word out loud. And these are expressions which deviate from normal linguistic prescriptions. And this could be a variety of things. It could be a malapropism, for example, or just a grammatical error that somebody tends to make over and over. Or it could be like a dialect or a patois or something like that. And to somebody who's trained on ordinary subjectivity, to learn to listen to language or read and write language in the very standard sort of way, that appears as an error or a kind of mistake. Whereas for Klosowski, these solicisms, and later on for somebody like Deleuze and Guattari and Lyotard, this idea of a tensor, that language has within it these aspects that can be sort of reconfigured, into new dialects and so forth, or, thinking of something like language poetry, which strips language of its grammar, of its grammatical function, reorganizes it in interesting ways in order to evoke some sort of emotional response, let's say in the form of poetry. In that way, language can be utilized to these ends. But given that Klosowski was an artist, he of course defaulted to art. What I think is interesting here, and maybe Vern can speak to this a little bit more, a lot of this seems to map on to the Apollonian and Dionysian distinction, especially as it's fleshed out in a book like The Birth of Tragedy, where the idea of Apollo is this idea of the emergence of new ideas, a kind of shining forth in the form of discrete images, all born out of this Dionysian flow, this flow of difference that then collapses images and creates new one, essentially the very flow that creates the transvaluation of values. And ultimately, I mean, just in my very cursory reading of Living Currency, and then long ago, Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, I think that's an ethical and an ontological priority for Klosowski. Is how do we get in touch with that aspect of not only ourselves and our artistic life, but it seems that it could be perhaps the font of a kind of revolutionary political action. Going back to what we said earlier as to why the importance of Nietzsche was upheld by the French communists, we can see that there is a theoretical basis here, and that kind of connects to Klosowski's commitments regarding art. What do you think, Noah?
No, I want to hear what Vern has to say, but I think that makes a lot of sense. I said this the pre-show. This is like my second time reading it. I understand Living Currency less, but this was kind of a jumping off point for another question that I had about what the Living Currency book really is trying to get at with this example of exchanging bodies. But I wanted, Vern, maybe if you wanted to respond to what Craig was saying, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
So Craig is right. What Craig said, I think, is it's kind of where I thought it was probably going, but I appreciate that Craig fleshed it out the way that he did, and in particular, to come to the point to talk about language. I think that this is one of the reasons why so many of the Frenchies are so, and arguably Nietzsche too, are so fascinated by the literary tradition as much as, if not more than they are the philosophical tradition, precisely because they're going to think that the really interesting literary figures are the ones who do the most to play with the limits of language and the limits of sense. And as Craig was talking, I was thinking, and Craig was talking about the ways in which poetic language and literary language can be framed, or not framed, that's a bad word, but can be articulated in such a way as to evoke more of an affective response than a rational response, even if only for a time, right? And this is crucial to the way that Deleuze and Guattari read literature. So if you think, for instance, about the Kafka book, the little Kafka book, one of the points that they make there is that Kafka will play with the inherent ambiguities within the Hebrew language, that, many of the Hebrew terms have 5, 6, 7 different senses. Spinoza makes a big deal out of this in the Theological Political Tractatus, that, the one word, ruah, perhaps, which means spirit, can mean, different things in multiple contexts. And so the entire process of reading ancient Hebrew scripture is itself loaded with all of these ambiguities that afford multiple ways of understanding the text, such that any such thing as like biblical literalism is a fool's errand. It's not even possible, right? But Deleuze and Guattari will point to ways in which authors will play with the limits of sense by, as Craig so perfectly put it, stripping a language of its grammar, reorganizing words, introducing words, right? Such that when you're reading it, it jars you momentarily, right? And you can't just re-stratify it on the field, in the field of sense, right? Because so often when we're reading language, what we're looking for is the sense, what are these words trying to say, the meaning, right? And we cancel out, our minds just skip right over the materiality of the language itself, right? And so Deleuze and Guattari will talk about language as emerging from the body, right? And it's a bodily emission originally, before it becomes syntactical, before it becomes grammatical. It's a bodily emission. So ways that we can use language to subvert the expectations of language. I think one of the dangers is that even when we do that, our mind still wants to try to make sense of it, right? So even when you're reading those authors like, say, Virginia Woolf, or I've been reading a lot of Cormac McCarthy lately. I think Cormac McCarthy does this a lot. I think James Baldwin does this a lot. I think Toni Morrison does this a lot, uses the language in order to subvert the language, right? Mm-hmm. But still, what we try to do when we're reading is we try to say, oh, okay, well, then this is what this means, right? When she does this, this is what she's doing, right? We try to introduce a new syntax. We try to introduce a new decoder ring, right? A new way of translating what's going on so that we can re-stratify it on the field of sense. And I think that the visual arts make this much more difficult to do than language, even though I think there are linguistic or literary authors who do it, and arguably philosophical authors like Deleuze and Guattari who do it, right? But nonetheless, the temptation in the reading is to re-stratify.
Well, you kind of do this in the opening of your lecture series, which we did a live stream on a few months ago, where you open with an analysis of the term logos.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
What better example, right, than the word?
Right. Right.
And I think that in a certain sense, like this is part of why, the proliferation of Nietzsche's, whether it's Klosowski's or Deleuze's or Derrida's, right, is so important, because like Deleuze and Derrida on writing and speech are going to be in totally different places. Yeah. Right. Like Derrida's over here on the side of the arcade trace, right? And Deleuze and Derrida are over here on the side of the body.
Yeah.
And the side of utterance and of voice. And I'm wondering then if part of the way we can understand, because one of the things Klosowski kind of does in his interplay, like I do think his analysis of Sade is important, but I want to kind of bring it back to why Sade is brought up in this book, right? Sade's framed as a proto-refutation of Fourier, right? And of the phalanx, which would end up being kind of, and what we see is the interplay between reflections on communal life and Enlightenment values kind of at odds with, not with one another, but like reinforcing each, like it's not, okay, they're not negations, but I don't know how to describe this. I'm really sorry. They're not. It's
perfect.
a Nietzschean thing, I promise. They're not negations, but each of these, on the one end, you have the utopian project of the Fourierists, right? Who will, like, the Fourierists will end up being important to Foucault in Discipline and Punish. Totally another forgotten element of French philosophy. And then you have Sade, and it's not that they're negating one another, right? But that they're each participating in the same kind of expropriation of, Craig would know this word better, voluptuous forces, but operating in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. So on Fourier's side, if I'm mispronouncing that, Fourier, I'm really sorry. That's 2 years of French and like tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, just totally worthless. But on the side of the Harmonian utopia, and then Sade has this framework of violation, but remember, it's still perfectly commensurate, and it's very important to Sade that it be perfectly commensurate with the understanding of the enlightened bourgeois subject, right? And this will be one of the most valuable things that Adorno and Horkheimer bring to the table, right? Really enforcing or bringing to the floor how Sade is in some ways an Enlightenment figure. Foucault's Sergeant of Sex interview also does this, where Sade is really reliant on a hierarchization of the body. So I'm wondering, is one of the reasons why Klosowski's Nietzsche is so important to these thinkers is in all different ways. Like, I don't want to flatten Deleuze and Foucault in this way. I don't want to flatten them with Derrida either. Is Klosowski's Nietzsche, and particularly the way in which his Nietzscheanism comes through in Living Currency, was it fundamental to the development of each of these philosophers' notion of force?
Can you frame that last question in like a
bullet point?
Yeah, like a bullet point.
Yeah. So, given the way in which Klosowski posits the utopian project and Sade's violent project as two different uses of force, is this comparison that does not rely on opposition fundamental to the development of force in thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, who are a part of this kind of not anti-Hegelian tradition, but something outside of the history of negation?
Yeah. I want to say yes. My only hesitation is that I'm thinking of like Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy being written in 1962. And I'm trying to think of and already there, Deleuze is looking for a way in which Nietzsche, provides an ontology of force that is useful for Deleuze's project and useful for, upending the moral image of thought. And I'm trying to think of the timeline of, the Klosowski Frenchy interaction. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure when Deleuze and Foucault and these folks discovered Klosowski. But nonetheless, even if we want to say that there was instead of an anxiety of influence kind of question, that there was more of an interaction between these figures. They're reading each other. And I think it's unquestionably the case that Klosowski certainly had an impact on the way that Deleuze and Guattari understood force. And I'm also thinking about what year is it 64 that the Zucker-Mazak book is written? 64, 65, something like that. A big part of what's going on is
67.
67, because a big part of what he's trying to do is to disentangle this notion that Sade and Mazak are, just antitheses of one another, right? He wants to say, no, these are two different ways of thinking about desire, right? And desire's relation to the social order as well. So that strikes me as a very Klosowskian kind of move as well. Yeah. So I would say I think it's difficult to pin down exactly the degree to which it was an influence, but it certainly seems to have been an influence.
In Anti-Oedipus, they do reference Klosowski, but I think there is some knockdown evidence actually in the introduction that Dan Smith provides in Living Currency. There was a letter that Deleuze penned to Klosowski with respect to the writing of Anti-Oedipus. And it's on page 3 of the introduction. Deleuze writes to Klosowski, you introduce desire into the infrastructure, or inversely, which amounts to the same thing, you introduce the category of production into desire. This seems to me of immense importance, for it is the only means to get out of the sterile parallelism, Marx, Freud, money excrement. Once again, I'm following you. And this, I think, was one of the big puzzles of 20th century continental philosophy, was how to navigate the corridors between Marxist theory and Freudian concepts. And I think, too, Dan does gesture to it, I think in the introduction or in the explication of Klosowski's concepts. There's a way in which, when you read Living Currency, and of course, we're coming to the end of the episode right now. We're just over the hour here. I think what we'll need to do amongst us at Acid Horizon and whoever decides to join us next time is to like really take this thing head on. But I think what I'll do ahead of that is actually do just a concepts video to summarize some of the basic ideas of Klosowski, because unless you've had a sustained engagement with this, it's really hard to maintain a hold of it. But just to go back to the Klosowski, Deleuze, and Guattari connection, I think there's a way in which the body without organs, as it's developed within Anti-Oedipus, is no doubt in debt to someone like Bataille, for example, when they say that the body without organs is the very process of anti-production within a system of socioeconomic production. But not only that, and just to go back to Noah's question about like, what is living currency? Living currency is this overlap between the complete, impenetrable, and incommunicable nature of the phantasm, something that cannot be fully rendered into language or articulated adequately into an image or even music, arguably. But that overlapping with the absolute exchangeability of currency, insofar as it does not represent any one particular thing. Bring in Deleuze and Guattari's notion of a body without organs under capital. Capital is the very thing that organizes all production and insinuates itself everywhere. But it's the one thing that capital itself cannot overcode, or that we cannot break into. Capital itself doesn't represent a thing or something representable. It occurs in virtue of its dynamism, of the flows. And I think that's where we see this connection between Anti-Oedipus and I'm writing a little bit roughshod over that, but I think that's the way to go in sort of forging the convergence between these two figures.